Welcome back for another study in the book of Proverbs. The topic for today is the slacker, or some versions say the sluggard, or we would talk about the lazy person. Now, about 100 years ago, somebody wrote a song called The Big Rock Candy Mountain. And in the Big Rock Candy Mountain, you have a hobo describe what he feels would be the perfect situation, the perfect place. And he says it's a place where handouts grow on bushes, where hens lay soft-boiled eggs, where the farmer's trees are full of fruit, and the barns are full of hay. And he says you sleep all day, where they hung the jerk that invented work in the Big Rock Candy Mountain. Now, I'm sure that the people who wrote this and the people who sang it do not realize that they're talking about God when they talk about the person who invented work, because God did invent work. If we look at the book of Genesis chapter 2, right at the very beginning, after the Garden of Eden was produced by God, it was a perfect place. The trees were pleasing to the eye, good for food, and so on. And in verse 15 it says, "The Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and take care of it." So work was ordained by God in the beginning, and how much work Adam had to do in the Garden of Eden, I'm not certain. The trees were already planted. We can be certain there weren't any weeds to have to chop out, but yet Adam did have some work to do. Now, after Adam and Eve disobeyed God and ate from the forbidden fruit, then things changed. In Genesis chapter 3, verse 17, God told Adam, "Because you listened to your wife and ate from the tree about which I commanded you, you must not eat of it. Cursed is the ground because of you. Through painful toil you will eat of it all the days of your life. It will produce thorns and thistles for you, and you will eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your brow you will eat your food until you return to the ground, since from it you were taken, for dust you are, and to dust you will return." So after the fall of man, then work became much, much harder. In the law of Moses, they had a form of welfare, but the form of welfare that they had included work. If we remember the book of Ruth, Ruth and her mother Naomi, mother-in-law Naomi, go back to Bethlehem, and they're widows and they're poor, and Ruth decides to go glean in a field. Now, according to the law of Moses, when the harvesters reaped the field, when they cut the grain, they could not reap to the edges of the field or the corners, and they could not go back over the field a second time. And poor people, by the law of Moses, could follow along behind the harvesters, and whatever they picked up was theirs. So God did have a system of welfare, but that did include work. Looking at the song, The Big Rock Candy Mountain, he talks about handouts grow on bushes. Well, we know handouts don't grow on bushes. Somebody has to work for them. And he talks about hens laying soft-boiled eggs. Well, you're not going to have hens if somebody doesn't work and give and feed them. And the farmer's trees are full of fruit. Well, we know, at least in this where we live, you're not going to have a fruit tree unless somebody goes to the trouble of planting it and watering it and so on. So, we really don't have anything without work. Back in the year 1607, the colony of Jamestown was started in Virginia. This was the first permanent English colony. And I believe about 101 English gentlemen came to Jamestown to start the colony. Now, these gentlemen were not used to working. They were wealthy, their parents were wealthy, and the way the situation worked in England, they had a law called the law of primogeniture. And what that meant was the oldest son got all the land. And so if you were the second or third or fourth son, you would grow up and have servants do everything for you, but you wouldn't get the land. Your older brother would. Well, these gentlemen, they were called, decided to come over to the New World, and they could have their own land. And so they get to Jamestown, and they weren't used to working. They were used to buying everything or having servants, and they come to Jamestown. Their money was no good because there was nothing to buy, and they didn't have servants to work for them, and they had a lot of problems. The men, most of them, spent their days out roaming around looking for gold, and there was no gold. And the Jamestown Company also had a policy that didn't help. The Jamestown policy was that everything produced went in the company storehouse, and then it was evenly divided among the men. Well, what that did, the men that worked hard saw that the lazy bums got as much as they did, so the workers decided they didn't need to work anymore. And the upshot was that first year, half the men died. And then the next year, Captain John Smith made a rule, if you don't work, you don't eat. And the colony started doing a whole lot better. But work comes from God, and we are to work, and work is good and work is necessary. In writing to the Thessalonians in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 and verse 11, the Apostle Paul told them, "Make it your ambition to lead a quiet life, to mind your own business, and to work with your hands just as we told you, so that your daily life may win the respect of outsiders, and so that you will not be dependent on anybody." We as Christians need to be concerned about our Christian witness. And even in our permissive society today, people respect somebody who works, somebody who's energetic, and so on. And so he was telling them that they should do that. And then later on in the 5th chapter, in about verse 14, he says, "We urge you, brothers, warn those who are idle, encourage the timid, help the weak, be patient with everyone." So he says to warn those that are idle. Evidently some there in the church felt that the Lord was coming back just any day, and they felt that since that was the case, they didn't need to work. And so the Apostle Paul corrects that. And in 2 Thessalonians chapter 3, and at about verse 6, he says, "We command you, brothers, to keep away from every brother who is idle and does not live according to the teaching you received from us. For you know yourselves how you ought to follow our example. We were not idle when we were with you, nor did we eat anyone's food without paying for it. On the contrary, we worked day and night, laboring and toiling, so we would not be a burden to any of you. We did this not because we do not have the right for such help, but in order to make ourselves a model for you to follow. For even when we were with you, we gave you this rule, if a man will not work, he shall not eat." And so the Apostle Paul gave the example that he worked. He was a tent maker, and he would go into a place and he would work, and most of the time he did not accept money from the people. He did a few times, but most of the time he just gave the example of working for what he had. And a job well done helps to build self-esteem, and increases our skills. And if it's a physical job, it tones our muscles, it sharpens our thinking system, and it can polish our social skills. So let's look and see what the book of Proverbs has to say about this. In chapter 13 of Proverbs, verse 4, it says, "The slacker craves, yet has nothing, but the diligent is fully satisfied." So it talks about the slacker, the lazy person who will not work, and says they want things, but they don't have anything, and says the diligent, those that work, are fully satisfied. Now we recognize that Proverbs is, most of the time, it works out this way, not necessarily all the time. If you've read the Little House on the Prairie books by Laura Ingalls Wilder, you know, Little House in the Big Woods, Little House on the Prairie, Little Town on the Prairie, all those books, she gets married to a farmer by the name of Almanzo, and I believe it's in their book, Those Happy Golden Years. They're living in the Dakotas, and Almanzo is homesteading land, and he works real hard, and he plows the ground, and he plants the wheat, and the wheat comes up about 2 inches tall, it doesn't rain, and it dies. And the next year the same thing happens. And the year after that he has to borrow money from the bank, and that means if he doesn't have a good crop, the bank gets his land. And again it doesn't rain, and he loses his land. And finally they end up moving back to Missouri where they have an apple farm, and I think there their hard work does pay off and they become prosperous. So in general, the slacker wants something and doesn't have it, but the diligent is fully satisfied. Then verse 14, there is profit in hard work, but endless talk leads only to poverty. We know some people, they talk and talk and they have big plans and they have, but that's all it is. It's just talk. And he says there's profit in hard work. Back when I was growing up and I was a teenager, my teenage friends and myself, we had two goals in life at that time. First, when we turned 16, we wanted our driver's license, and second, we wanted a car. And that was our big ambition, our big goal in life. Well, the day I was 16, I got my driver's license, and my parents told me, sure, you can have a car, but you got to get a job. You got to pay for it. So the first job I had, I was 16. This was the summer before my senior year in high school. I got a job on a landscaping crew. And what this consisted of, well, first off, I was the youngest person on the crew. I was the only Anglo on the crew. There was a company that was building houses in Scottsdale, Arizona, and they would build the houses and put in the asphalt for the roads and the concrete for the sidewalks, and they would build the house. And then the landscaping crew, we would go in with big rakes and we would rake up the yard, we'd rake up the piece of concrete and all that kind of stuff, shovel it into wheelbarrows and smooth and level the land, and then plant trees and so on. And this was in the summer and it was blazing hot and there wasn't a bit of shade anywhere. Now that was very good for me because heretofore I had not been very interested in education. I wanted to pass, but C was as good as anything. But after I spent that summer and saw those grown men with families working that way, I realized that an education was a good idea. And when I went back for my senior year in high school, I decided to start applying myself. And so work is good. And if my parents would have told me, yeah, you can have a car, pick one out, we'll pay for it, that would have been the worst thing that could have happened to me. And I don't know where I'd be today if they had done that. So there is profit in hard work. Later on I read about Abraham Lincoln. He said, my father taught me to work, but he didn't teach me to love it. And Abraham Lincoln decided he'd rather work with his brain than with his muscle. And I decided the same thing myself. Well, chapter 20 then, verse 4. The slacker does not plow during planting season. At harvest time he looks, and there is nothing. So when it was time to plow the land and to plant the crop, the slacker, the lazy person, didn't do that. And then when the harvest time comes, he looks and there's nothing to reap. And in the book of Galatians it says we reap what we sow. Now in the book of Galatians this has a spiritual thought that if we sow to the Spirit, we'll reap the Spirit. If we sow to the flesh, we'll reap of the flesh. But it also applies to everyday life. We reap what we sow. If the farmer doesn't sow in his field, he's not going to reap anything. And this also has other application for us. For those of us that are married, you know, we need to pay attention to our marriage. We need to pay attention to relationships and put effort into it to strengthen the marriage, because if we don't, it's like the slacker doesn't work, doesn't try, and then the result is he doesn't have anything. Well, chapter 24, verse 30. He says, I went by the field of a slacker and by the vineyard of a man lacking sense. Now no doubt this slacker inherited the field from his father, and the person with the vineyard, he inherited that vineyard. But they were slackers, lacked common sense. In verse 31, thistles had come up everywhere, weeds covered the ground, and the stone wall was ruined. So the farmer, instead of having a crop, he neglected his field, and it was full of weeds. It was full of thorns and thistles and weeds. And I'll tell you, it's a lot easier to chop a weed off before it goes to seed than to wait and let it go to seed and then have a whole bunch of weeds to chop up. But that's what had happened. And then the person with the vineyard, the stone wall was ruined. The stone wall was built to keep out animals that would bother and eat the grapes and so on. But this person let the wall fall down, and so animals got in and devoured the crop. And verse 32, it says, I saw and took it to heart. I looked and received instruction. So the idea was, take care of what you have. Don't just let it take care of itself, because if you do, it won't take care of itself very well. I know of a field that used to be across the street from where we lived, and they raised alfalfa. And then somebody else bought it, and they let it go to weeds, and it was just solid weeds, and no good for alfalfa anymore. And then verse 33 says, a little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the arms to rest. And your poverty will come like a robber, your need like a bandit. Now God wants us to have sleep. He wants us to have rest. And under the law of Moses, they had the Sabbath day. And the Sabbath day was meant to benefit people. Now in the days of Jesus, the religious leaders had made the Sabbath into something that didn't really benefit anybody. But human beings don't usually take the moderate way. The thought of a little sleep and a little slumber, the study guide says, well, that's Satan's handbook for failure. We can take things that are good like food, and we need food, but we can overindulge, become overweight, harm our health, or some people don't eat enough and they starve themselves. So, we do need sleep and we do need rest, but too much and too little is not good. And some people are workaholics, and they work all the time, and they go and they work so much that they don't neglect their family, neglect their wives, and that's not good either. And then chapter 26, verse 13. The slacker says, there's a lion in the road, a lion in the public square. So this slacker is making excuses. Instead of going and working his farm, he says, there's a lion in the road, so I'm going to stay home today. Or if he's got a job in town, he'll say, the lion's in the public square. And so these are excuses to keep from doing what he really ought to do. Then chapter 28, verse 19. The one who works his land will have plenty of food, but whoever chases fantasies will have his fill of poverty. So here again it talks about the farmer that works the land and has a good crop, and the person who doesn't, the person who talks about it or says chases fantasy, he will be have his fill of poverty. And then in chapter 6 of Proverbs, it says, my son, if you have put up security for your neighbor, if you have struck hands in pledge for another, it says you better get out of that situation. I think here it's talking about going on a note with somebody. And years ago I attended a church the church had a lot of financial hardship because they had done this. They had a preacher who wanted to buy a house, and evidently the preacher's credit was not good enough for him to buy it. He wanted the church to go on the loan with him. So the church did. They signed the note. And what that meant was if the preacher couldn't make the payments, the church was liable for it. Well, he didn't stay around very long. He left town, and the church then was stuck with making the house payments. And the house had been bought when the housing was very high. They paid a high price for it. The bottom had fallen out of the housing market, and so here the church was stuck. And for years they suffered paying for that house because they had basically put up security for your neighbor. And the latter part of chapter 6, verse 1 says, if you've struck hands in pledge for another or with a stranger. And I've been reading a book about General Grant, and several times he made business deals with people that he didn't know. And General Grant was a very honest man, and he expected everybody else to be honest, but he he was cheated several times because he did this. Then we continue on with chapter 6 and verse 6. Go to the ant, you slacker, observe its ways, and become wise. Without leader, administrator, or ruler, it prepares its provisions in summer, it gathers its food during harvest. Now we live on 3 acres, and in the back field, I leave the red ant nests alone. We also have horny toads, and the horny toads eat the ants, and so I leave the ants for the horny toads to eat. And I've observed the ants some, and they're pretty amazing little creatures. I've never seen a lazy ant, and I've seen ants drag food and things back to the ant nest way bigger than the ant themselves, and they'll just struggle and struggle, and they never quit. And I've also in the summertime noticed after we get a good rain, a lot of times queens will come out of the nest, and they will go, and each queen will start its own nest. And I've observed these queens, they'll start digging a tunnel, and they'll bite a little grain of sand or something with their mandibles, pull it out and drop it, and they'll go in and they'll pull another one out, and they go in and they back out. Well, once they get big enough, and I have not observed this, I imagine they start laying eggs. And then those eggs hatch, and then they have workers, and then the workers start working, enlarging the nest. And after a while, I imagine all the queen does then is to lay more eggs, and the workers immediately enlarge the nest, and they start bringing in food. And they work hard all summer, and then when it gets cold and you have winter and snow and so on, the ants are underground and they have food. We've all heard the story about the ant and the grasshopper, and Walt Disney had a little short cartoon about this, where the grasshopper played and fiddled all summer long, and he sang a song, "The World Owes Me a Living," and he kind of taunted and criticized the ants. He said, "Why do you work all the time? Why don't you sing and dance and play like me?" And in the summertime, there were plenty of green leaves for the grasshopper to eat. But then, of course, winter came and the leaves all died, and it got cold, and the grasshopper then was in misery. And the ants, on the other hand, who had worked all summer, they were underground, and they were living in plenty. Then chapter 10, verse 5. The son who gathers during summer is prudent. The son who sleeps during harvest is disgraceful. So here you have a son that when it's harvest, they work hard. And a person would need to work extra hard during harvest. You know, maybe there would be grain to take in and they could see a storm coming. Well, they would work extra hard to get it in. But the son who slept during this time was disgraceful because the harvest would stay in the field and would be ruined. And then chapter 14, verse 4. Where there are no oxen, the feeding trough is empty, but an abundant harvest comes through the strength of an ox. Now an ox would be a big, powerful animal, might weigh 1,500 pounds, and the ox might eat 60 to 70 pounds of food a day. And someone might say, well, I don't want to go to the effort and the expense of buying an ox. I don't want to go to the effort of feeding it that much every day, so I'm going to farm without the ox. Well, the problem was that the oxen was needed to plow the field. Back in those days, they didn't have steel plows like we have. Back in those days, what they had was very primitive, and you needed a big, powerful animal in order to plow. And then after the grain was harvested, the ox would walk over the grain and would separate the grain from the husk. And so if a person went to the trouble of feeding the ox and taking care of it, their harvest would be much greater because of that. And then chapter 21, verse 20. Precious treasures and oil are in the dwelling of a wise person, but a foolish man consumes them. So this is a very good principle here, and the idea is save more than you spend. Don't spend everything that you earn. Some people spend everything they earn, and then they borrow on top of that. In our society today, it's so easy to get credit cards, and it's so easy to run up a huge credit card debt. But the day comes when, when you can't do that anymore. And so he says the wise person has precious treasures and oil, because they don't spend everything they have. They save some. And it doesn't matter how much we make or how little we make. You know, if we have to spend it and have to buy, it will never be enough. And then chapter 24, verse 27. Complete your outdoor work and prepare your field. Afterward, build your house. So the idea is work on the field, get the crops in, and then start working on the house. When Abraham Lincoln was a boy, his family moved from Kentucky to Indiana. And his father bought some land, and the land had trees all over it. And they did this very thing. They worked taking down the trees. They worked getting in the harvest. And they spent very little effort on their house. The house they lived in that first winter was a three-sided house, and in front of it a bonfire was kept going day and night to keep them from freezing to death. But they put all their effort into clearing the land and getting in a crop. And then we move over to chapter 11 and verse 24. And here now the idea changes, and we have the idea of giving generously. A person works hard, they're prosperous, and then in turn they should give generously. Chapter 11, verse 24. One person gives freely, yet gains more. Another withholds what is right, only to become poor. Now, it's an absolute fact, borne out by the testimony of many people, that if when we get paid, we give to God first, that our money lasts longer. And as far as the world is concerned, that's foolishness. But like I said, that's a fact borne out by the testimony of many Christians who do that. And then verse 25, a generous person will be enriched, and the one who gives a drink of water will receive water. Generous person will be enriched. We think about the geography of the land of Palestine. You have the Sea of Galilee, and the Sea of Galilee in the time of Jesus was full of fish, and to this day it still is. And the Sea of Galilee has an outlet, the Jordan River, and the Jordan River then runs into the Dead Sea. The Dead Sea has no outlet, and it's dead. And I've been told if you drink that, the water is poisonous. And so the idea, a generous person will be enriched. And then chapter 19, verse 17. Kindness to the poor is a loan to the Lord, and he will give a reward to the lender. The one who gives to the poor, this is verse 27, will not be in need, but the one who turns his eyes away will receive many curses. So in the book of Proverbs, the wise man Solomon gives us instruction as to not be slack or not be lazy, but to work, to take advantage of our opportunities, and then when we become prosperous, to give to the Lord and then to give to others. Homer Collier was a fantastic, wonderful man, and I remember what he said has always stuck with me. He said, the only thing you really get to keep is what you give away. And in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 and verse 58, it says that our labor in the Lord does not go to waste. And when we labor for the Lord, those are things that will last forever. And so the only thing you get to keep is what you give away. And so I have 1:06 left, and so I think we will go ahead and close at this time. We appreciate everybody being here and the wisdom that comes from the wise man Solomon.